PP Poo Poo Man 42 asks, how did the Allies in World War II decipher German Enigma? As a former military intelligence officer myself, the story of breaking the Enigma codes is fascinating to me. I'm Peter Knight from the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is World War II Support. Ace of Spades 629 asks, what is the best statistic that puts the scale of World War II into perspective? One statistic that really stands out is the death toll. Upwards of 85 million people, including military and civilians, perished. There were 100 million combatants from 50 nations. In terms of gross domestic product spending, the United States spent between 35 and 40% annually. Germany, 50%. Here is a question from Quora. What is the timeline of World War II? Most historians and scholars agree the approximate start of the Second World War is Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Because at that point, Hitler's invasion causes Great Britain and France to declare war on Germany because they have guaranteed the security of Poland. Our next point will come in 1941, when the Soviet Union is invaded by Hitler. Russia had initially signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and they agreed to divide Poland between them when Hitler invaded in September. However, Hitler turns the tables on Joseph Stalin and invades the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. This brings us to our third turning point, the Battle of the Atlantic in 1943. This is a battle for control of the Atlantic sea lanes that enable the United States to send war materiel across the Atlantic to the aid of Russia and Britain. Unless they can secure those sea lanes, that equipment will be taken out, and the German U-boats run roughshod, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping. Our next point would be the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. The Allies establish a beachhead and a foothold on the continent of Europe and open up a crucial second front against Hitler's Nazi forces. Our next major point are the two atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August the 6th and the 9th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito knows it's only a matter of time, and he gives a radio address. This is the first time that many of his subjects in Japan have ever heard his voice, and he asks them to endure the unendurable and submit to the unconditional surrender to the Allied powers. Which brings us to our final point. September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese sign the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and World War II is brought to an end. HHT Lucas asks, y'all ever think about how the Nazis were on meth like all the time? Nazi soldiers did indeed get methamphetamines distributed to them. The idea was that these very powerful drugs would allow them to stay awake for longer periods of time, would enhance their mental alertness, their aggressiveness, essentially enable them to succeed and win in combat. But there were some significant side effects, extreme exhaustion, and hallucinations. That being said, it wasn't just the troops that were getting drugs. Hitler received all kinds of opioid injections, oxycodone, cocaine, that were used to help him cope and get through his day. On the Allied side, GIs and other Allied troops got what were called go pills, Bezedrine, which was an amphetamine, not a methamphetamine. So these are less powerful and less potent than the pills the Germans were taking. And most of the time, Bezedrine was used by Allied pilots that were on these very long bombing run missions just to stay awake. Nobody Grotesque asks, what are some World War II movies that are the most historically accurate that one can learn from? The Steven Spielberg film Saving Private Ryan, its opening sequence of the troop landings on Omaha Beach on D-Day, are some of the most realistic depictions I've ever seen, and they're based largely on soldier accounts. There's a moment where you'll see soldiers disembarking from the landing craft, and they'll immediately be submerged in the water. That's very true to life, because as the landing craft approached the beaches, some of the parts of the beach had received some early naval gunfire, and there were craters, and they're stepping off into water that is over their heads. So some of these soldiers who are immediately immersed in the water and sinking like a stone, they're panicking. and they're getting shot at the same time, and some of these unfortunate soldiers will drown in the process. Another movie is The Longest Day, based on the book by Cornelius Ryan, that shows a lot of the D-Day activities. For example, the use of dummy paratroopers, these little straw men that they dressed up to look like soldiers, and they'd throw them out of the aircraft to confuse the German forces as to where the airborne divisions were going to land. The German term for the dummy was Gummipuppen, and you hear them talking about this over the radio, and they're just ranting about it.
Gummipuppen.
It's somewhat humorous in that context. Kyle Lindsay has a question. Ever heard of the Ghost Army in World War II? It's one of those wild true tales that sounds like a Hollywood script, but actually happened. The name of the unit is the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops Unit. This unit's mission is to create the illusion of military forces in different places through the use of inflatable tanks, inflatable troop-carrying ships, fake weaponry, fake radio transmission traffic, all for the purpose of deceiving the Axis powers into thinking that certain troop formations might be larger than they actually were, or in the case of the preparation for Operation Overlord, D-Day, creating an entire fictional 1st U.S. Army group allegedly led by General George S. Patton that would make a landing at the Pas de Calais as opposed to Normandy, and selling the Germans on that fake plan. Annie Losin writes, I still don't understand, why would Japan bomb Pearl Harbor? One of the biggest reasons why Japan decides that they have to attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet is because of an oil embargo President Franklin Roosevelt imposed upon Japan. Pearl Harbor is located on the island of Oahu. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, believes that they must strike and cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in order to allow Japan the freedom to embark on their military campaigns to conquer the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya over here that contain the natural resources, oil and rubber, that the Japanese absolutely need to sustain their war machine and their industrial economy. If we look at where Japan is, the Philippine Islands is between the Japanese home islands and those desired targets. The United States controls the Philippine Islands, and they will be attacked within 9 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese will attack Pearl Harbor on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. They will succeed in crippling several of the battleships, especially the USS Arizona, that will carry over 2,000 soldiers to their death. And it does do a lot to set back the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but it does not succeed in destroying it. Japan missed our oil and fuel refineries and our big dry dock facilities that will enable us to continue to fuel and supply our fleet and repair it and recover from the loss. At Matchless Mine asks, when did Hitler declare war on the U.S.? Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States on December 11th, 1941, a mere 4 days after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Sipwell asks, how effective were German U-boats in World War II? From the start in 1939, easily through most of 1942, German U-boats successfully sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. They're sinking Allied shipping faster than the Allies can build the ships. Some of those sinkings occur within sight of the U.S. coastline. The biggest single factor that turns the tables on the German U-boats is the cracking of the German Enigma codes. The cracking of the Enigma codes allows the Allies better success in locating the U-boats and destroying them. This is huge because with the German U-boat threat negated, this enables the Allied forces to move enough men and material, planes, vehicles, weapons over to England to be able to stage for the invasion of Western Europe. PP Poo Poo Man 42 asks, how did the Allies in World War II decipher German Enigma if there were millions of possibilities for letters and it was being changed every day? I absolutely love this question. As a former military intelligence officer myself, the story of breaking the Enigma codes is fascinating to me. The Allies are able to crack the German Enigma due to a number of different factors. Polish cryptanalysts and mathematicians were able to reconstruct the German Enigma machine and smuggle a version of it out of Poland just as the Germans were invading in September 1939. That copy of Enigma was given to the British. The British then take it and put it in the hands of their cryptanalysts working out of Bletchley Park. And those cryptanalysts partner with American mathematicians and cryptanalysts, and one in particular by the name of Alan Turing. He is able to invent an electromechanical machine that is able to compute the different combinations that the Enigma machine can generate. And then they're able to crack the Enigma codes because of the human frailties of the system. Those who would be creating Enigma traffic would use certain phrases the same way each day, and looking for those same phrases or messages or plain text, which we refer to as cribs, helped the code breakers be able to determine what the Enigma machine settings would be. Most experts will estimate the cracking of Enigma alone shortened the war anywhere between 2 and 4 years. Here's a question from the World War II subreddit. How far back does the chain of events go to lead to World War II? World War II has its roots in the First World War. In the Treaty of Versailles, Germany is forced to pay crippling reparations to demilitarize and accept full responsibility for the First World War. This, combined with the Great Depression, absolutely cripples the German economy, and the German people are looking for a hope, a way out of this. Adolf Hitler provides that by promising to remilitarize Germany, to revive the German economy and its war machine for the purposes of territorial expansion. In the meantime, Japan embarks upon imperial expansion, invading China in 1931. These are the chain of events that set things in motion. A question from the Ask Historians subreddit is, were there any nations totally unaffected by World War II? The short answer to that question is no, although there are 14 nations that maintained neutrality status throughout the entirety of the Second World War. Among those 14 were nations like Sweden, Switzerland, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ireland, small little states like Liechtenstein and the Vatican City, and they would help either side as it suited their purposes. This map, although it's in Russian, certainly shows you the battle lines and movements of large troop formations across the globe over the course of the Second World War. And as you can see, the war leaves basically no part of the planet unscathed. Here you can see a lot of the action in Europe. You look in the Pacific, it's a much more spread out, wide area, different island chains. But then India, of course, is part of the British Empire. And so Britain is going to fight to protect that. And the China, Burma, India area is referred to as a China, Burma, India theater, where the American commander Vinegar Joe Stilwell works to advance Allied interests and defeat Japanese forces in this area. So as you can see, between the European theater of operations and the Pacific theater of operations, this is truly a global conflict. Rippendank Bonks wants to know, what was the point of the invasion of Normandy from a tactical standpoint? The invasion of Normandy from a tactical standpoint probably doesn't make a lot of sense to the average viewer when you have to fight up over the beach against elevated German positions in concrete pillboxes. It seems like an impossible task. But you have to remember, you can't just airdrop armored divisions from planes onto the ground in Europe. There are German armored forces already on the continent. They have to create a beachhead. The Normandy beachhead is the ideal place for the Allies to strike because it is the weakest point of the Atlantic Wall defenses, and it has the best beachfront area to make their amphibious assault onto the continent of Europe. This picture is taken just after D-Day. Now they're going to begin to pump their logistics up onto the European continent. The balloons that you see are designed to be an impediment to enemy aircraft. They have cables there that would entangle the aircraft if they were to try to fly a bombing run or a strafing run along the beach. Doug Says Howdy 03 asks, what is your favorite war tactic that was used or developed in World War II? One of my favorites is hedgerow busting. As Allied forces were bogged down in the Hedgerow country in Normandy, the hedgerows are these large earthen embankments that mark the property boundaries of farmers' fields. The Germans used these earthen berms as defensive lines that they would hide behind and then place their crew-served weapons and wreak havoc on any Allied troops that were coming across the fields. The Allies had to find a way to quickly get across the hedgerow country. They take some of these steel beams that were used to make the hedgehogs, the tetrahedron-shaped obstacles that you see on the landing beaches on D-Day. They cut some of those with acetylene torches and welded them to the front of their Sherman tanks. And then they used that protrusion to bust through the earthen berm of the hedgerow. And this was highly effective, so they could spearhead with the tanks, and then the infantry could follow on through. And that was what they used to help bust out of the hedgerow country, where they would launch Operation Cobra, and Patton's Third Army would start to sweep across the European continent. Ironside asks, reading up on World War II for the first time, the Axis powers versus the Allies, eh? Who named them? A damn fan fiction writer? The name Axis powers is actually coined by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who referred to his relationship to Nazi Germany as forming an axis around which the rest of the European nations would rally around. The term Allies is actually a holdover from World War I, because that is how the Triple Entente powers, Russia, Great Britain, France, referred to themselves. The Allies are united out of necessity to keep one another in the war, to be able to sustain their ability to wage the war. For the Axis powers, their shared interest is territorial expansion, but each of them are not necessarily so invested in helping one another unless it's really necessary. You're not going to find German troops fighting in the Pacific, for example. And the level of cooperation of the political leadership is much greater on the Allied side than you will find on the Axis side. Mussolini often becomes more of a puppet of Hitler than anything else. NFT Crypto God asks, what is the Blitzkrieg? Blitzkrieg is a term that Western journalists like to apply to the German approach to offensive operations. The better term is Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, and the Germans use this tactic, which involves speed and the combination of infantry, artillery, armor, and close air support, to attack the enemy in their weakest positions, to allow them to bypass enemy strong points and then surround the enemy and destroy them. German forces could cover hundreds of miles of territory in a matter of a few hours. Opponents could not respond with a coherent defense in time. In a matter of weeks, they will overrun France and force the British forces to evacuate from the continent of Europe through Dunkirk. Denise Viola Play asks, wow, I never knew about the World War II Bat Bomb Project. In the New Mexico desert, where the Manhattan Project is underway at Los Alamos trying to develop the atomic bomb, there was also the idea that we could use bats to deliver incendiary devices against Japanese villages whose buildings were made largely of paper and wood. You would freeze the bats and then place the incendiary napalm-containing devices to the chests of the bats and place them in canisters that could then be parachuted down onto enemy soil. And then the bats, once they were released from their canisters, would take refuge in the various Japanese building structures, and then the incendiary device would go off. They tested this in New Mexico, and they ended up burning down other structures rather unintentionally. And I think they thought better of the idea, because once you release the bats, you can't get them to stop. After that, it's really out of your hands. Tripster asks, why was Iwo Jima so important to the war effort? It's just a naked 8-mile square rock in the Pacific. Iwo Jima is certainly more significant than that. In 1945, the Allied forces have captured the Marianas Islands. Those islands will allow B-29 German long-range bombers to range the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima lies halfway between the Marianas Islands and the Japanese home islands. And the Japanese had an early warning radar system deployed on Iwo Jima that needed to be knocked out to enable those bombing runs from the Marianas to be successful. One of the most famous pictures in all of history is an Associated Press photo that captures U.S. Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi, the highest elevation on the island of Iwo Jima. What's interesting about this is the second flag raising. There was an earlier flag raising, but then they had to continue fighting against Japanese that were still resisting. And still, the island of Iwo Jima was not completely secured until a couple of weeks later, after 5 weeks of brutal fighting. Southside Tilly asks, please tell me about the Night Witches. The Night Witches were the 588th Night Bombing Regiment of the Soviet Red Air Force. This was an all-female unit and does as many as 23,000 missions, and they used these little wooden biplanes. The speeds of these planes were so slow, German fighter planes were too fast to even try to maneuver against these more primitive planes. And these planes would basically throttle down their engines when they were about to drop their ordnance. And when they did so, they made this whooshing sound. And that's what made the Germans name these all-female pilot squadron the Nachthexen, or Night Witches. Their leader was one of the first, actually the first, to receive a state funeral, having earned the status of hero of the Soviet Union. Her plane crashed in the Battle of Stalingrad. Here's a question from the Explain Like I'm 5 subreddit. Why is it Germany, Italy, and Japan allied, despite all believing themselves to be the superior races? The real reason why these countries ally together is shared interest in territorial expansion. For Germany, it's Hitler's concept of Lebensraum, living space, for the German peoples, and trying to unite those parts of Europe that are predominantly German. For Italy, it's expanding into Africa, namely Ethiopia. For Japan, the invasion of China in 1931 and expanding in through Manchuria. With regard to their superiority of their respective races, I think they all held that to themselves, and perhaps that was a bit of division between them as well, because they're never as close of an alliance as the Allies will be. Our next question is from Quora. Before GPS, how did soldiers in combat accurately know their location on the battlefield when they called in close air support? For soldiers to understand their location and a target's location, they have to use the good old-fashioned map and magnetic lensatic compass. I have one here. This is standard US GI issued magnetic compass. Soldiers would have to take a known point on the terrain, shoot an azimuth to it, and then do the same with some other points, and then basically triangulate their positions and confirm their position on the ground. By the way, just an interesting side note as we're talking about things like the compass that are a part of a standard GI's equipment kit. The American GIs would often wear identification bracelets. They didn't have dog tags necessarily at that time. This particular soldier, Raymond Toynbee, served in the 36th Infantry Division in Italy. Okay, next question. Inner Game of Den the Men asks, what did Churchill actually do in World War II? Sir Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and his relationship with U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt is absolutely essential to cementing Allied war strategy to allow the Allies to prevail. He was a hard drinker, an incessant smoker. He actually had a penchant for liking to walk around naked in his household, and he even did so at the White House when he was visiting there one time. His favorite outlet was painting. He actually had his own painting studio at his home in Chartwell. Winston Churchill is an inspiration to the British people. His people were able to look to him, and he provided them a beacon of hope on which to focus. In late 1940 and 41, as the Germans are bombing London, Churchill is a steady, calm voice to the British people, telling them that we will continue to resist and that we will never surrender to Nazi tyranny. Here's another one from the Ask Historians subreddit. In the famous scene from the movie Der Untergang, and here they're actually referring to the movie Downfall, Hitler orders all of his generals to leave the room except Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, and Bergdorf. Who were they and why were they different or more important? So the movie Downfall depicts the final days for Adolf Hitler as he's hunkered down in the Führerbunker in Berlin as the Soviet Red Army closes in on the German capital. And Hitler is forced to face the reality that his last-ditch efforts to defend the German capital are amounting to nothing. He dismisses most of the officers in the room and sticks only with his very close inner circle. Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of staff of the German High Command. Alfred Jodl is the chief operations officer of the German Wehrmacht. Hans Krebs is the chief of staff for the German High Headquarters, and Bergdorf is Hitler's adjutant general. This is his inner circle, along with his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. And they're the ones that remain in the room. And he goes into this long tirade, berating his generals, calling them cowards. But it's really just a raging rant, after which he admits that the war is lost. That fateful meeting takes place on the 22nd of April, 1945, as the Red Army is closing in on Berlin. And the deterioration is just accelerating. Hitler is thinking in his own mind that he's a dead man. And now he's trying to figure out, well, if I'm going to die, I think I want to die on my own terms. He looks at what happens to Benito Mussolini, who is hung and his body left on display in Milan on April 28, 1945, to be humiliated and desecrated by Italian partisans in his country. He decides that it's better for him to take his own life, which he does. He takes a pistol and shoots himself in the head. He leaves instructions to take his body and burn it. However, when the Soviets take Berlin, they go into the Führerbunker, they actually find some dental remains, and they're able to positively identify Hitler from his dental records and confirm that he's dead, though they don't make that fact known to the rest of the world. Here's another one. What do you think was the turning point of World War II? One of the big turning points is Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union. He's banking on his ability, having overrun Western Europe, that he can conquer the Soviet Union before the British, French, and the Americans amass a force against him. The turning point comes at the Battle of Stalingrad. The entire German 6th Army is surrounded in Stalingrad and forced to surrender. 220,000 German troops, 91,000 will survive to surrender to Soviet forces. At that point, Germany's momentum on the Eastern Front is done. They will now go on the defensive and will remain on the defensive for the duration of the war. Neil Brown fan 69 asks, and I quote, U.S. education is dog. Why we never talk about how we hit North Africa first in World War II. This is a matter of strategy. In 1942, the Americans are all for going immediately for the cross-channel invasion into Northern Europe. In order to facilitate a cross-channel invasion into Northern Europe, you have to have enough water transport to put your troops and all of your materiel on the ground. They did not have enough landing craft to be able to accomplish that feat. What they decided was the American troops have to commit somewhere so that they can get some combat experience on the ground, because they haven't really fought since World War I. That is why we do the torch landings in 1942 to land in North Africa and trap Rommel's army between the British 8th Army under Montgomery coming out of Egypt and the American forces coming in through Morocco and Algiers. Mike Miller wants to know, Patton was a great general, but do you think he would be good as the top general of an army? He was a little crazy, laugh out loud, which is what made him interesting. George S. Patton was certainly one of the most talented generals that the Americans had. He was a fighting general, tailor-made to command an armored division, an armored corps, and an army in combat. And he does all of those things in World War II. He was not the diplomat that Dwight Eisenhower was. I don't know that he would have been a great supreme commander in terms of working with the Allied partners. Patton was very outspoken, very passionate, and very pragmatic, and also a bit of a prima donna when it came to ensuring the success of his own campaigns and getting his name in the headlines a bit. He had a bit of an ego there, but he had a dogged determination in combat. His exploits with the 3rd U.S. Army during the Battle of the Bulge, where he comes to the liberation of Bastogne, covering many miles in just under 72 hours and attacking the Germans, rescuing the 101st that was encircled there. It's one of the most tremendous feats of armed combat in American and world history. Mad Season 1994 asks, how much did the German population know about the concentration camps during World War II? How much did the Americans and other allies know? German knowledge of the concentration camps varies depending on their proximity to the camps and their involvement in the operations of the camps. While folks who lived in or near the concentration camps probably knew of them and had some idea of what was going on in there, whether or not they were aware of the methods of mass murder is up for debate. When did senior leaders like President Franklin Roosevelt find out about the camps? They have knowledge of the camps as early as 1942. And then they have knowledge of the Zyklon B gas chambers and the extermination method there in 1944. Senior leaders like Eisenhower and Patton actually make it a point to take the local German citizenry and make them walk through the camps, such that Germany can never deny what was taking place there. The evidence of the Holocaust and the treatment of the Jewish prisoners is irrefutable. There are photographs, there is documented film footage of liberating these camps, seeing the emaciated bodies of the deceased and the emaciated bodies of those still living, and seeing some of these prisoners in striped pajama-type outfits. You just look at them and you can see that they have been starving. So for the American soldiers that are rolling up on these camps and liberating them, the shock effect is palpable. The Allied leadership is very adamant that this be recorded such that future generations could never dispute the fact. Petite Acorn asks, why was Eisenhower chosen over other more experienced generals as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe? Dwight David Eisenhower never commanded a large combat formation. People wonder, well, why would we choose this man as opposed to others who are much more seasoned, have more battlefield experience, or leading larger size units? Dwight Eisenhower was selected for this position by General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff. In the years just prior to the outbreak of war for the United States, Eisenhower is instrumental in helping to craft the war plans and war strategy of the United States in the event that it were to enter the war. He had the personality and the diplomatic skills to be able to work with both politicians and his fellow general officers of the Allied coalition. He began as the commander of American forces in the European theater of operations. He is appointed such in 1942, just ahead of Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa. A year later, he is named the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force that will make the cross-channel invasion into Europe. A question from Quora, was America's mainland bombed or attacked in World War II? The answer is yes. There was a Japanese sub that lobbed some shells against a fort in Oregon and against an oil field in Santa Barbara, California. And there were some 900 Fuku 90 balloons that Japan launched, armed with incendiary explosive devices that were meant to explode on North American U.S. soil. About 100 of those actually made it to U.S. soil. I believe that there were 6 Americans, and there were some women and children in that 6, that were killed in the vicinity of Bly, Oregon as a result of those balloons, but that was the extent of the damage. John Blackburn, 75, asks, did the atom bomb really force surrender of Japan, or would it have happened anyway? How many lives, if any, did the bomb save on the U.S. side and the Japanese side? You have to remember that the Japanese home islands had been firebombed in the months preceding the 2 atomic bombs, and still Japan had not yet surrendered. The firebombing campaign, and especially the Tokyo firebombing alone, killed over 100,000 Japanese because it created such a firestorm that sucked up all the ambient oxygen and boiled the rivers. It just absolutely obliterated everything. The death toll and the destruction toll exceeded even the 2 atomic bombs. But still, Japanese resolve held firm. And so I think it was the shock effect of the atomic bombs being such a terrible and powerful weapon, plus the knowledge that the Soviet Union was going to enter the war now. That's what's going to break their back. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands was referred to as Operation Downfall. Estimated casualties for the Allies were over 1 million. Estimated casualties for the Japanese population would be over 10 million. And so it made the decision for Harry Truman very pragmatic in that he authorized the dropping of both atomic bombs to avoid the horrific casualties that would come with an invasion of the Japanese home islands. So those are all the questions for today, and they were good ones. Thanks for watching World War II Support.